Oh, hi. You caught me judging community plants. Speaking of judging things, let's talk about 90s superhero costumes.
Comic tropes. Comic tropes.
Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. In 1992, 7 of Marvel Comics' most popular creators all left at once to form Image Comics, and it cannot be overstated what an impact this had on the comics industry. Suddenly, Marvel didn't have a bunch of its top talent like Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee, but even DC was feeling the effect because of the popularity of this new publisher. Image Comics were both flashy and gritty. Marvel and DC took all the wrong lessons from this and tried to chase a trend. That almost never works. You see, they were trying to mimic the look and the feel of Image Comics, but they were never looking any deeper than surface level. They were only looking at the flashy style, and it led to them giving brand new looks and makeovers to a lot of their established main characters. None of these looks were good. A lot of them were downright terrible. But today, we're going to take a look at some of the worst new costumes superheroes had in the 90s and try to ask the question behind it. What were they thinking? Changing the look of an established superhero needs to be considered carefully. Their look is essentially their brand. But it can be done well, with a good story to support it, like when Spider-Man got his black costume in the mid-80s. But when a look is changed to mimic what's popular, it's not being carefully thought out. One big trend in the 90s at both Marvel and DC was armoring up superheroes. In the 1993 Batman story Nightfall, Bruce Wayne is crippled by Bane, and he hands over the mantle of Batman to Jean-Paul Valley, better known as the new superhero Azrael. Jean-Paul quickly started to lose his mind and began armoring up his Batman suit until it felt like it was comprised of layers of weapons and knives. It got pretty far away from the idea of Batman as a quiet detective and martial artist who lurked in the shadows. This made for an ugly, but all things considered, short-lived costume for the character. It is not the worst offender that we're going to take a look at today, and that's because the story actually kept showing us a subplot of Bruce Wayne on his road to rehabilitation. So I think there was always a sense that someday the real Batman would return. And I think to some degree, the overall arc of the story was commenting on this is the grim and gritty type of superheroes that are popular. Is that better than the original? I think that that's what they were going for. And of course it wasn't better than the original because the new Batman looked like if he took one wrong step, he'd slice his own leg open. Batman at least dealt with that story for a year's worth of stories across several titles. Other superheroes tried new armor for much shorter periods. Captain America wore an armored-up version of his suit for 6 issues in 1995 when he briefly didn't have his super soldier serum. And as we later saw with the Iron Patriot suit, a recolored Iron Man suit could look cool. But with this goofy helmet, he looked too much like the 1970s TV movie version of himself. And the bottom line is, Captain America isn't Iron Man. It was a poor fit. In 1997, Catwoman briefly wore an armored version of her suit to fight a similarly themed villain called Cybercat. Since that costume was designed by Jim Balent, who later went on to become famous for his softcore porn comics like Tarot, the Catwoman armor featured such helpful additions as a visible belly button and extremely shiny breast armor. Daredevil briefly wore armor in 1993, which almost makes a type of sense since his powers include extremely sensitive senses, including touch. But his new suit was not a visual improvement, and it made him look like he was about to join an extreme lacrosse league down in Florida instead of stopping criminals. Plus, this must have taken Daredevil ages to put on. Let's not forget that the guy is blind. Also in 1993, Booster Gold joined the incredibly 90s team Extreme Justice and put on new armor. Technically, Booster Gold has always worn armor, but he's from the future, and he had a skin-tight version of armor that allowed him a full range of motion. His new suit basically kind of just made him look fat. Actually, it sort of reminds me of that guy who spent his whole life trying to design an anti-bear suit. Except at least that guy still had a helmet. Booster Gold decided to just ditch that part of it. Who needs it? In 1994, DC launched a new version of the superhero Dr. Fate. The original Dr. Fate was a sorcerer. The new version was a smuggler that melted the magical helmet and made them into knives. He also wore armor on just one arm, which doesn't seem quite as good as both. Somehow this comic actually lasted 2 years, and then relaunched for another year in an imprint DC appropriately titled The Weirdoverse. These days the regular Dr. Fate is back, and he doesn't have an Ankh tattoo on his face. I'd argue that the main reason none of these looks worked is because it didn't fit the personality or powers of the superhero. If a superhero's main powers are hand-to-hand combat or magic, why do they need armor on top of that? Iron Man is special because he's a scientist and a genius who made his own armor. He invented his own powers. But that becomes a lot less special when everybody's running around in a suit of power armor. Also, Iron Man at least has a cool look most of the time. These guys all look like NFL Super Pro rejects, an NFL Super Pro that got cut on draft day. Another quick and easy change was to attempt to make a character more sexy. From 1992 to 1994, Invisible Woman wore a radically different suit than she'd been wearing for 3 decades by cutting out a big number 4 over her boobs. In story, we were given the explanation that Invisible Woman was under the influence of an evil personality called Malice, and that's why she changed her look. But I don't think that necessarily justifies running around as a mother and a scientist in a completely impractical costume. It's not unforgettable. All right, Marvel, you can use that tagline on your next movie. That's okay with me. In 1995, the Wonder Woman title followed the ways of the other big DC superheroes, Superman and Batman, by placing a new person in the role of Wonder Woman. This was Artemis, in a move by Wonder Woman's mother to cheat fate, because it was said Wonder Woman was soon to die in battle. But Diana wasn't going to stop being a hero just because she'd been depowered. In fact, that story had been explored from 1969 to 1970. Writer Denny O'Neil had decided to make Wonder Woman more of her own person, separate from Greek mythology, by removing her powers and having her operate as a super spy who also ran a flower shop. It wasn't well received. More than 20 years later, DC didn't do much better, because this time they put Wonder Woman in a costume that was apparently comprised of biking shorts, the world's smallest bikini top, and a very small leather jacket, none of which would be particularly useful in a fight. You'd think that wearing skin-tight spandex might be sexy enough without having to sort of cut parts out, but whatever. Anyway, the final idea in giving these characters completely new looks would be throwing out everything that came before and giving them something absolutely brand new. It doesn't have to have any rhyme or reason. It doesn't have any sense of logic. This was a time when Marvel and DC were honestly just throwing stuff on the wall to see what would stick, and a lot of it was very, very ugly. In 1994, DC had turned Hal Jordan evil and had him wipe out all of the Green Lantern Corps. There was a brand new replacement called Kyle Rayner, but this left another character hanging in the wind. Guy Gardner was a backup Green Lantern that had his own title, but then there was an editorial mandate that he be given new powers. Specifically, writer Bo Smith said that editorial wanted Guy Gardner to have some sort of shape-shifting powers to capitalize on the popularity of the new Mighty Morphin Power Rangers show. So now, Guy Gardner was given a bunch of colorful tattoos and arms that could turn into guns. It lasted about a year. Superman was also given a big makeover. His solar powers had briefly been taken away, and when he was repowered, he became a being of energy that had to live in a blue containment suit. He had completely different energy-based powers and a completely redesigned look. This lasted from April of '97 to May of 1998, in other words, a year, across 4 titles. And it was not very popular, it was not very well received, but personally, I actually did like this one. When a character like Superman has been around for over 60 years, it can be hard to come up with new story ideas. And I thought that following Superman, Clark Kent, the same person, but with absolutely brand new powers and trying to figure out how he could be a hero with a completely new set of powers, I thought that that was an interesting story worth exploring. And personally, I liked his new look because I knew that eventually his iconic look would return. But I'll admit, I'm in the minority on that one. Doctor Strange shaved his facial hair and grew his hair long when he had to find a new source of power for magic, when the Vishanti cut him off from casting spells. He turned to chaos magic, which honestly sounds fairly interesting, but it just didn't last long. Even shorter was Punisher coming back from suicide as an angel who hunted demons. It just did not fit the character. Some looks lasted a bit longer, but were never very popular. Aquaman grew out a beard and long hair, which is honestly a pretty good new look, but his hook hand always felt like it would be a real hassle for a swimmer or a superhero. Wolverine might have gotten it the worst. Magneto pulled out his metal skeleton, which had the effect of mutating him into a more animalistic creature. At first he just had a bigger head, but shortly new artists just started drawing him without a nose. But after that started to become his new status quo, a fill-in artist drew him looking normal, and the writer gave no explanation why. The fill-in artist drew for 2 issues, and then there was a new storyline where Apocalypse abducted Wolverine and put adamantium metal back into his body, and no one ever mentioned that time where Wolverine looked radically different. It just sort of faded away. But when it comes to bad looks, there is one era that featured more new bad looks than any other. In 1995, the Avengers was not selling well at all. The issues of Avengers and the solo titles of Avengers members were being written and penciled by mid-tier creators at best. There was an editorial mandate to create a new version of Iron Man that was young and hip. This brought about a massive Avengers crossover storyline called The Crossing that essentially said that their time-traveling enemy Kang had brainwashed Iron Man almost from day one to be an evil sleeper agent. The Avengers in turn brought a teenage Tony Stark from the past to defeat him. These issues were plagued with lots of bland fill-in artists and writers that honestly just did not seem to be invested. They made all sorts of continuity errors. It just wasn't very interesting. But the worst thing of all was that just a couple issues after this storyline ended, Marvel decided to reboot it all anyway. They handed the keys over to Image creators Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee to do Heroes Reborn, which was the Avengers characters in sort of a pocket dimension, set aside from the rest of the Marvel Universe. That also deserves its own storyline, but it's hilarious that Marvel was like, oh, instead of chasing trends, why don't we just hire the guys that are creating those trends? I'm surprised they didn't think of that solution sooner. But again, we're not going to review The Crossing or Heroes Reborn. Instead, we're just going to take a look at some of the awful, awful costumes that came up during this storyline. Hawkeye got rid of his iconic mask and basically started wearing leg, waist, and shoulder pouches. Fairly bland, but honestly a lot better than his brief look in the 70s where he decided to fight crime in what can only be called a miniskirt. Black Widow and Hercules both started running around with bomber jackets, and you'd think that the acrobatic Black Widow wouldn't want to be impeded by such a bulky jacket. You'd think that Hercules, being a god, would want to look more regal. Also, Hercules, never shave your beard. You look terrible without it. War Machine got new shape-shifting alien armor. Not only was this awfully close to Guy Gardner's story, but it looked arguably a lot worse, with a really lame skull helmet that should only be worn by uncles going through a midlife crisis and buying their first motorcycle. Wasp literally cocooned up and came out looking like a monster, but for some reason, she was totally cool with this. Janet Van Dyne has been one of the all-time best leaders of the Avengers and a rich clothing designer, but she was okay tossing that all out the window to have permanent bug eyes and wings. Thor wore this disastrous outfit for all of one issue. Massive shoulder pads and exposed abs. How did he even put that whole getup on? He wore it for all of one issue in his own title, and then, unfortunately, a Marvel-DC crossover comic, where you know the entire DC universe was probably laughing at him behind his back. Scarlet Witch showed up at the end of The Crossing in a new outfit, which was bland but fine. But like I said, none of it mattered, because just a couple issues later, Marvel rebooted things with Liefeld and Lee. I think that there are commonalities in these decisions to give these characters new looks that just did not take off. They were all very unpopular, they were all disastrous, but there are commonalities, and that is a lot of this was coming from editorial mandates instead of a writer that was passionate and had time to set up and evolve a story organically. You know, if you're going to just be told you have to create a new look for a character, sometimes a writer isn't going to be passionate about that. Also, Marvel and DC were honestly hurting for top-level artistic talent at this point in time. So a lot of these costumes were designed by artists that were either sort of new to the industry or just were never going to be a top-level talent. So you ended up, ironically, sort of pushing a lot of creators to other publishers like Valiant Comics or Malibu Comics Ultraverse imprint. And so Marvel and DC just had a really hard time throughout all of the 90s. I think that there are lessons we can learn from this. I think that it never really works to try to chase a trend because you never exactly know what your audience is going to like tomorrow. Instead, I think the best that you can do is try to create a story that you're passionate about, that you think is interesting. Because if you think it's interesting, there's at least a good chance that other people are going to agree and also find it interesting. All right, folks, that's going to do it for this week's episode. Next week, I am back as part of something called Cobra Convergence 3. That is a month-long event that a bunch of YouTube creators all participate in, and we're all reviewing stuff about Cobra from G.I. Joe. And specifically, we're trying to look at underrated stuff. So I have something very special planned for that. I'm very excited about that episode, actually. Thank you to Hooded Cobra Commander 788 for inviting me and for organizing it. There's a lot of other channels involved, so look for the hashtag CC3. Go to Hooded Cobra Commander 788's channel and you can see a bunch of other videos about Cobra. So, I have some fan art this week. I'm taking a look here. We have returning Peter Saga. Appropriately enough, Peter Saga has drawn me as my own G.I. Joe guy. I love it. Thank you, Peter. I appreciate that. Jeremy Landry also returning, and he made me look extra cool. I think that might just be a little too cool. Ken Ives, I've lost track of how many submissions Ken has turned in, but here is another one in which I'm in the world of My Hero Academia. Thank you very much. We have this piece by Chris Burbridge, which envisions me as a skunk ape, because of course my channel name is Skunk Ape. Thank you, Chris. Very creative. And finally, we have this piece by Kevin Hoover, which is not only hilarious, but I think actually does make me look cool. I think looking smart is cool. Okay, so if you want to do some fan art about this show, just send it in to comictropes@gmail.com, and every week I will show every piece of fan art about the show. If you've got like a website or something, send me that as well, and I can put that up, or a social media account. Let's see, Peter Saga and Jeremy Landry have both won before, so they said they were only sending the art for fun, that I don't need to put them in the running for the Gachapon prize. So I've got 3 names. I'm going to sort of crumple them up here and yeah, just sort of drop them in to the bag of Gachapon, shake it up, and I'm going to draw one out. Oh geez, where is one? Of course I can't find one. Oh, here's one. The winner is Kevin Hoover. Kevin, you will win a Gachapon. Let's draw that out now. This is, I think it's some sort of Super Mario piece. It looks like it's a Super Mario Gachapon. So these come from Japan. I love to give one out randomly to anybody that submits fan art for the show. Thank you very much, Kevin. And I believe Kevin is also one of my patrons, so thank you to all of my patrons. That's really helping right now. Yeah, it's just tremendously appreciated. The channel's been going through some amazing growth, so thank you everybody for not just watching, but hitting subscribe, hitting like, sharing it on social media. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much, and until next week, keep reading comics.